In the next few minutes, I want to open the Bible to the book of Galatians and look at what Paul said in Scripture about racial separation in the church. I'm not going to talk about racial issues in the society as a whole or all over the world, but what does it say in Scripture? What is the scriptural view, and how do we apply that in our local situations? I'm right now in the United States, and some of what I'll say will come out of U.S. history, but I think the application of Scripture is universal. The last 3 months of social distancing and quarantine and isolation has taught even an introvert, non-people person like me that I really need others. In American history, 400 years of racial separation and racial isolation should teach us that we need one another. Now, some say, what do you mean 400 years? America's not even 400 years old. The first black African slaves were brought to America in 1619 in Jamestown. From 1619 until the 13th Amendment in 1865, slavery was legal in America. That's 345 years of legal slavery. From 1865 to 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, that's another 100 years of racial discrimination being legal. The Voting Rights Act tightened some of the loopholes and dealt with legal issues. So between slavery and other racial issues and the legality of that, that's 345 years of American history where there is the dehumanizing treatment of blacks by whites in a legal situation. Now, since then, we've had 55 years of, for the most part, certainly there are laws that can still be rethought and passed, but for the most part, the legal work has been done, but we still have 55 years of racism and prejudice and bigotry in the hearts of people. There was a legal solution to some of the problem, but the heart can't be changed by law. The heart can only be changed by the gospel. So, what does the Bible say about racial separation in the church? Let's look at Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, 12, 13, and 14. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? Now, the context of this is we've got the two strongest, most honored, most fruitful apostles in the church at that time in a disagreement, a very intense and very public disagreement. Peter and Paul. It's not a theological disagreement. They were on the same page theologically. It's not even a missional disagreement, but it's a conduct disagreement. And we'll see how it worked out, and there's a lot we can learn from the way they worked it out in this context in Galatia. It's fascinating to me that in verse 9, we see that when Peter went to Jerusalem, we're told that he was given the right hand of fellowship. I don't have time to get into what all that means, but that's a good thing. He was given the right hand of fellowship by Peter. But when Peter goes to Antioch, he's rebuked by Paul. Paul goes to Jerusalem, Peter gives him the right hand of fellowship. Peter goes to Antioch, he gets rebuked. Now we're in Galatia, and he's not only rebuked face to face, there's a public rebuke. It's being brought out in this letter that we're still reading about 2,000 years later. But what it says is, in verse 11, I opposed him to his face. And he didn't talk about him behind his back. Paul didn't hint and talk to others about Peter. He talked to Peter face to face. And when we have disagreements in the church, especially as leaders, we have to talk face to face. Even if we disagree, especially when we disagree, face-to-face conversation is the biblical way to work out disagreements. Verse 12, it gets to the heart of the disagreement. We've got two different groups of people, two different ethnicities. Yes, there were cultural and there were religious backgrounds and all of that, but make no mistake, this was an ethnic, racial issue that was part of it. There are Jews and non-Jews, ethnic, racial Jews and non-Jews, Gentiles. And so Peter would, remember the sheets coming down and don't call what's clean, unclean and all that. Peter finally realized that Jews and Gentiles needed to work together and needed to be a part of the church together. He had already had that, he had passed that, but now here he is, he was eating with them. And that's a big deal, eating in their homes and eating together. It's not a big deal now in most of our cultures today, but in those days that was a big deal. And it said a lot, that a lot of lines had been crossed. But when these hardcore Judaizers came and visited, Peter separated himself. And this is what he's getting called out for. Verse 12, it says he separated himself fearing the circumcision party. And I wonder how often it's the fear of criticism and the fear of people and the fear of the culture and the fear of what people would say that causes us to create ethnic and racial problems within the church. But the way Paul handled it is the way we always need to handle disagreements, whether they're theological, cultural, or whether they're behavioral. Face-to-face conversation. Verse 13 tells us, Paul said the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with Peter. So separating himself racially was called hypocrisy, and it set a bad example for others. Then he goes on and says, even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So 2 times in verse 13, this action, this separating according to racial groups within the church, twice is called hypocrisy. Back in that day, in Greek theater, they didn't have makeup artists like we have today or prosthetics and all of that. So the actors, to play different roles, would put on a mask. It allowed the audience to engage better with the culture and with the storyline. And that is the root word hypocrisy. It's a mask. It's someone acting. It's someone acting as someone else, not real. And so what he's saying is, Peter, you put a mask on. You're play acting. This is not the real Peter, the one that God called with the sheets and with the vision and that God moved mightily among the Gentiles. What has happened to you? And so he gets rebuked in verse 11. And then he gets called, this activity, this action of separation is called hypocrisy in verse 13. But then we get to verse 14. And I think oftentimes the question is, what issues demand a response from Christian leaders, and which ones can we just ignore and not worry about? Because nobody wants to be the one who's always confronting something all the time. There's always something out there. The question that this text answers is, which issues demand a response from spiritual leaders? How do we determine? We can't speak to every issue in every culture, in every city, in every nation, and on every campus. We can't do that. But some issues demand a response. How do we determine that? Well, right here it tells us that the reason he speaks, that Paul says in verse 14, when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. Right here, Paul says it's gospel issues that demand a response. Paul elevated racial harmony in the church to a gospel issue. When it's a gospel issue, it demands a gospel response. One study estimated that only 5% of the churches in America are ethnically diverse. Now, by diverse, what they mean by that is that there is no more than 80% of one ethnicity. So diverse doesn't mean a church of 300 with one person who looks different. That would be considered monoethnic, but multicultural, multi-ethnic would mean that there was no more than 80% of one ethnicity. So only 5% of the churches are like that, which means 95% are monoethnic. Why is that? A lot try. There are a lot of pastors and a lot of churches I'm aware of who really try hard, but some reason they're not able to pull it off. I don't know all those answers, but I do know one thing people say. It's difficult. It's really difficult. Yesterday, I spoke to 7 pastors on the phone, both black and white here in America. And some were long conversations, some were relatively short, but there was a common thread, whether the pastor was black or white. When I would ask how they're doing in this season in America, almost everyone I spoke to said something like this: I'm tired. Many times people retreat from diversity because it is difficult and it is tiring. But when we see it as a gospel issue, we don't retreat. We run to it. When I think about that, I remember one of my son's weddings. His wife is a Filipino American. Her grandparents came from the Philippines and she grew up in the States. And there were many of the Filipino guests at the wedding who commented how much they enjoyed an American wedding. Many of the Americans at the wedding commented how they enjoyed a Filipino wedding. And to the Filipinos, it wasn't really a Filipino wedding, it was an American, the way things were done, and to the Americans, it seemed very Filipino. But it was a combination of both, and that's how multi-ethnic church is often. If it's a black and white, many of the black people feel like they've stepped into a white church, but many of the white people feel like they're in a black church. If it's white and Latino, they feel the same thing. If it's Asian Latino, Asian black, whatever it is, nobody ever feels totally comfortable and totally at home. And I actually think that's okay. Maybe better than okay. Maybe that's a good thing, that we don't have total comfort and something that's just exactly what we want or what we're used to. Because I think oftentimes the gospel pushes us out of our comfort zones. I started out talking about the idea of ethnic, racial separation in the church. It's what Paul dealt with here in Galatians, especially in chapter 2. Then he jumped into other things, but he made it a gospel issue. He brings the gospel into it, and I want to end with what he says at the end of this chapter. After the verses we look at, he starts unpacking the gospel. And he brings the gospel in because ultimately the gospel is the solution to whatever our heart issues are. But look at how he ends it with that classic verse in verse 20. It's one of the first verses I memorized as a new Christian many, many years ago. It's a verse that needs to be deep in our souls and deep in our hearts. Here's what he says in Galatians 2:20 to wrap up this conversation about race in the church in Galatia. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. And by implication, Paul's saying, he brought the cross right in the center of this conversation about race in the church. And he says that God gave himself up out of love, and by implication, that's how we're supposed to do with one another. God so loved us that he gave himself up. We have to love others, that we give ourselves up and we give our preferences up. Make no mistake, the Apostle Paul made racial issues in the church gospel issues. And he brought a gospel solution with Christ and the cross right in the center of the solution. Apart from Christ, there is no solution. Apart from the cross, there is no solution. We can and should do everything we can to change laws and change structures and change cultures, but only the gospel can change hearts.